Good morning and good evening to our friends across the pond. Welcome to Dialogue Supply Chain 2020. This is the first in our panel in our TBGA Summer Leadership Series. I am Laura Ely, the leader of Advisor Services at the Barnes Group Advisors. I've been with the group for 2 years. There's never a dull moment supporting a team of AM experts and our founder, John, with running the company. I'm an M&P engineer by background, and I'm very passionate about optimizing processes, connecting companies and individuals with the right solution, and developing and inspiring people. If you happen to see my eyes flash, if anyone happens to mention directed energy deposition, just know it has a special place in my heart. It's where I got my start in additive manufacturing 6 years ago when I got to build out a laser wire DED technology team for GCAN Aerospace in North America. But today is not about me. We welcome Philip Moslener, there we go, who has been active in the railway industry for nearly 25 years. He's born in Canada and graduated from Concordia University in Mechanical Engineering. Philip started the additive manufacturing group at GE Transportation in early 2017. Now, through the recent Wabtec GE Transportation merger, his team serves the entire Wabtec Corp in creating prototypes, tooling, spare parts, and now production parts for locomotives, as well as freight and transit subsystems. In his current role, as Wabtec's Executive Director of Cloud Platform and Applied Innovation, his team is also responsible for developing software solutions that leverage disruptive digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, big data, and machine learning. Previously, he held various roles with Bombardier Transportation in Canada, USA, China, and Thailand. We're particularly excited to bring in Philip's obvious global perspective. As a car builder, he had the pleasure to contribute designs and project management to exciting rail projects across the globe, ranging from high-speed trains to intercity trains to commuters to subways. Welcome, Philip. Our second panelist is Carlton Washburn. Carlton is a dynamic and driven professional with a diverse technical and business background with degrees in physics, mechanical engineering, and engineering management. He is a fellow St. Louis area resident. Since COVID is an obstacle to our in-person coffee chats, these virtual meetings will have to suffice for now. Carlton is one of those. Kirk, I think you need to move, please. Carlton is one of those unique people who really shine when operating at the intersection of strategy, technology, and people. He specializes in finding and integrating technology into organizations. This has resulted in success ranging from several industries, including partnerships at a small high-technology manufacturing company in the semiconductor industry, to minority equity investing at a global Fortune 25 company. Carlton is currently the program manager for Boeing Additive Manufacturing. I'm going to guess that everyone is pretty aware of the Boeing company, but I think it's important to highlight that they have many flying polymer AM parts, as well as quite a few metallics. Last, but absolutely not least, is Ivan Madera. I met Ivan several years ago on the AM conference circuit. I really enjoy his candor and his business savvy, as well as his personal story. If you don't know it, ask him sometime. He pulls from more than 20 years as a management consulting executive. A change maker and recognized thought leader in the metals aerospace additive manufacturing industry, Ivan's experience as an entrepreneur and executive leads him to invest in innovation. In 2015, Ivan founded Morph3D, a thriving AM solutions provider for aerospace. Morph3D's AM products have landed on the moon, orbited the Earth, and strengthened the designs of customers like Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Collins Aerospace. Morph3D is part of Boeing's Horizon X and AM global investment portfolio. Ivan's core values are manifested in his business, starting with skilled engineering, design, and production, and ending with strong, dependable customer collaboration and communication. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what brought us to this panel in the first place, and then we'll welcome our panelists on screen. Manufacturing companies are suffering due to the pandemic, from disruptive global supply chains to significant decreases in product demand, causing cost-saving measures like budget and workforce reductions. Some industries were already reeling due to other business factors, with the pandemic essentially kicking them while they are already down. Juxtaposed with the negative was a historic moment, the first commercial launch of US astronauts into space. This highlighted advanced technologies. Another interesting aspect that we saw was that polymer AM was in the spotlight for solving PPE shortages, as many manufacturer companies mobilized their printers for stopgap supplies. As we try to wrap our heads around the impact of the pandemic, we're pondering these questions. What impact is the pandemic having on the manufacturing supply chain? And how does that translate to the industrial AM supply chain? I'd like now to invite our panelists to come on stream. Our panel will progress through 3 key themes. We'll look at individual perspectives and really their unique business perspectives from each of our panelists. We'll then progress to speaking about the global supply chain. And finally, we'll discuss the specifics of the additive manufacturing supply chain. Interlaced throughout this conversation will be results and insights from our recent TBGA supply chain survey and individual interviews we did with our friends across the supply chain. We will launch a few live anonymous polls. We encourage you to respond as they pop up in the right-hand portion of your screen underneath the heading polls. You are welcome to add questions to the chat at any time. We will monitor those. If they are relevant to the current topic, we will try to get them included. Otherwise, we will have an open Q&A session in the latter portion of the panel. I will also say, since this is a web-based platform, if you experience any interruptions in the platform, I recommend that you refresh your browser. So I'm going to pop off now, and I'm going to ask our panelists to please join us.
Good morning.
As they're coming up, welcome. We're checking in to see what Zoom shirts they're wearing today, as Carlton had pointed out. I like that Ivan has livened it up with some lighter color there. Welcome, gentlemen. Now that we are launching into our first theme, individual perspectives, I'd like to run our first live attendee poll. The question to all of our audience, please just look on the right hand underneath the poll for the ability to respond, is: do you see the pandemic influencing the way industry sees and could use AM? So we'll let that run for a bit once that launches, and we'll check in on that response a little bit later. To kick off this section, I'm going to review 2 of our survey responses, and then we'll get into questions for the panelists. The first survey question was, what change have you seen in your company's revenue due to the pandemic? Is this a short-term or long-term change? We found that 45% of respondents showed a projected decrease in revenue over the next 6 months, with an additional 30% saying that that would be a long-term impact greater than 6 months. We did have a little positive blip with a very small population that showed an increase in revenue. The second bit of data is a relatively data-rich plot, I will say, where we ask the question, which business impacts did your company sustain due to the pandemic? We had responses that range from changes in operating R&D budget, factory schedule, capital item purchasing, temporary or long-term changes in staffing, and change to new product or process schedule. For this one, we did look at the demographics based on the industry, and we broke them up between commercial, defense, and industrial products. On average, the darker green bar shows that nearly half the respondents reported that operating budgets took the largest hit. And defense, shown in blue, showed the highest impact to operating R&D budgets at nearly 75%, followed by changes in staffing at 50%. Commercial aerospace, shown in light green, showed a tie for biggest impact of operating budget and change to new product process schedule. The outlier for this was industrial products that showed a different trend, with change in factory schedule and capital item purchasing selected by 50% of the respondents. It's not surprising that we see differences based on industries, and that's part of why we look to bring a bit of diversity to our panel with the industries that these guys are representing. So we'll launch into our first question. How has the pandemic impacted your business and industry? And we'll direct this one to Philip.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for having us. Yeah, so I mean, every industry is different, right? So, but in ours, where we're transporting goods and passengers, or our customers are transporting goods and passengers, we were considered an essential service, making sure that the trains keep on running to bring goods and get the essential workers to their work. So basically, of course, like every other heavy industry, we had to look at our costs and make sure we had the right cost structure, but also we shifted our efforts much more to making sure that the networks kept going by sort of providing services and maintenance services or spare parts. But also it's also helped us look at where create new opportunities, if you want, for us to try to help the customers deal with this, especially in the passenger rail side, where passenger confidence is one of those key elements that we need to get and help our customers deal with. So that's how we felt it in our industry.
Thank you, Philip. Should we move to Carlton?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think that the pandemic has deeply affected Boeing's customers, our airline industries. We have tremendous empathy for what our customers are experiencing and what they're going through, and our CEO has been very vocal about the challenges that we're facing and that Boeing is adjusting to support their needs. And when I think about additive in that context, I actually think about how we bring value to our customers. Boeing has been placing parts on aircraft for over 20 years, and we've got somewhere north of 70,000 flying parts. As you said, both polymer and metal. But beyond the flight hardware, tooling is an area that we bring value to our customers. Tooling, jigs, fixtures, these types of things has been a mainstay in additive for many, many years. And at Boeing, it allows us to accelerate innovation, to improve quality and those types of things. I think from the pandemic side, we've just really had to sharpen our pencil and make sure that the things that we're doing, whether it's a flight hardware, whether it's a tooling thing, or we're bringing value to our customers and we're doing the right things with additive. So it's forced us to get, I think, smarter and better.
Thank you. Ivan?
Yeah, good morning. Different perspective, clearly from a supplier standpoint that serves the aerospace and defense industry that's taken quite a bit of an impact here. I would say walking into 2020, super optimistic. I said I'd be unfiltered, so I'd be unfiltered. We had a backlog that was larger than our 2019 revenue walking into 2020 with plans to double this year. So Q1 was super strong up until about March 10th or 12th is when things started to get a little interesting. I personally, I like to double down, if you would. We brought in a group of interns to continue to support the business. And it was up until about, I would say, 4 weeks ago. So I would say probably about 14 weeks into the pandemic where things really started to take a turn with respect to shifting in business. So that made us take a pause, reevaluate, and make some really tough decisions as a business owner. So clearly we have, we weren't immune to the effects of COVID. We scaled back a little bit, but the strategy is still what it is, right? It's still to focus on the aerospace and defense market, which we still see a huge opportunity in. Nonetheless, the backlog is really what's keeping us. Q2 was, I would say, a non-existent quarter for order intake, but we're starting to see a good uptick in the last, I would say, 8 to 10 days. Things are starting to turn around a little bit. And the majority of that is access to facilities, right? Our customers don't have access to facilities, so they don't have access to testing components or doing some of the analysis that they would normally do. So
it's good that we at least have some positive news that there's signs of perhaps things starting to turn around. So that's very encouraging.
Sure.
Okay, we're going to move to our next question. So within our survey, we asked people, do you see the COVID-19 pandemic influencing the way industry sees and uses AM? Just the same as our survey question. So we did allow for maybes. We didn't in this one. So all your engineers that say I need more data to answer definitively yes or no, I'm sorry, but we forced a yes or no question in this. But in the poll right now, we're showing the answer to that question is 81% of our audience today says yes, they do see the pandemic influencing the way industry sees and uses AM, and 18% at no. Similar within our survey responses, although we did allow for maybes, and we did allow a little bit more striation on the type. Realization that AM is more than a prototyping tool, shifts towards AM production with polymers, and shift towards AM production with metals. And we saw responses showing that there was positives in all of that space. So let's go to our panelists and ask them the same question. Do you see the pandemic influencing the way industry sees AM? And then, of course, the secondary question, which is how? Let's start with Carlton this time, please.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things that showed up, especially on social media, about additive manufacturing that the pandemic brought to light that I don't think we had really seen before as an industry. And that maybe changed the viewpoint of additive. And my world has always been very industrial focused, on how do we use additive to bring some sort of industrial solution. And the shift to supporting healthcare workers, PPE, and that type of thing, I think really did influence the industry. It changed the way that we looked at additive. In some ways it was positive, in some ways it was negative. I think with that, time will tell exactly how that flows out. But for the most part, I've seen, at least on the industrial side, that though, and I'll talk probably later more about Boeing's role in that, we did what we could to help, and then we shifted right back to the industrial focus. So our conversation was fairly brief in regards to the pandemic, and then right back to that customer value.
How about your perspective, Ivan?
So I think there's been a bit of a jolt. And I go back to when I first started the industry 7 years ago, exploring the industry. There was a lot of hype, right? And I don't want to use that word negatively, but I think the hype has really brought forth the way you can use additive to quickly respond to a shortage. But it's exactly that. It's a short-term type solution to a longer-term type kind of problem, if you would. So there are limitations clearly that are also coming out of this. But for now, I think it's played a huge role. So the way I look at things is, it's forced us to rethink the way we buy, where we buy things from, clearly, and how we're sourcing components is one big thing. How we buy it is different as well, and what we buy, right? Things that we bought before from forging or tooling or casting or machine part could be completely different coming out of this. I said this yesterday, and I've said this before, is that once the light turns back on and you have to go find your hundreds of parts in the supply chain, it's extremely difficult to really understand where those components are and the complexity of the supply chain that we had in existence with the pandemic. And then turning that light on and keeping it bright to ensure that there's continuity in your business is pretty big. So I think there's a big way now, or spotlight, if you would, that's being shined on AM as a potential solution to reduce some of that risk in future failures, if you will.
Philip, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, for us, to carry on what Ivan just said, I mean, it's about speed. AM, for those of us who are in this space, we know that speed is one of those factors that makes this technology differentiator. But for those who are still trying to acquire it, learn about it, it really identified how AM was really quick and fast. And at the onset of the pandemic, AM was the fastest out of the blocks. The supply chains were trying to figure out what was going on and trying to assess the situation, and AM was there to really support, well, as we all know, healthcare workers with PPEs. But as the supply chain readjusted, then we were there to help our own workers and to cope with this in terms of protection, but also getting parts which were not available at the time. And then as that supply chain started to adjust as well, then moving on to our customers and how can we help them. So AM was always there at first, which started with solutions quicker than anything else, and we're talking about physical solutions quicker than any other supply chain. So I think what it did highlight is, for those who are not really familiar or intimate with it, is how AM does bring speed to our customers and to the solutions.
Thank you, Philip. With that, we're going to move on to our second theme, which is focused on the global supply chain. And we're going to launch our second live attendee poll. You guys should know where it is now, underneath polls. And we're asking our audience this question: is your company rethinking their supply chain strategy due to the pandemic? Similar to before, we have a survey question that we ask, the exact same question. We saw almost equal responses, 50% across the board. We did allow people to check any that they felt applied. For yes, reshoring or onshoring increases in importance. Yes, distributed localized manufacturing increases in importance. And yes, agility increases in importance. The next one on the list was elimination of points of failures. So let's go to our panel with this one. Do you see companies rethinking their supply chain strategy due to the pandemic? Philip, I'd like to start with you, please.
Yeah, so I rethink, again, every industry is different. For us, rethinking is maybe a big word. It's looking for, we have the right strategies, of course. I know we talk about a lot of onshoring. And then, so for us, onshoring is a concept which is maybe more abstract, where we've got over 100 plants and service shops across 50 countries. So it's hard to understand what is onshoring, what that means. For us, it's like right shoring and having the right strategy. So rethinking is maybe big, but making sure that we plug the holes in our strategies and having the right planning and plan B is really important for us.
Excellent perspective. Carlton, from your perspective.
I think distributed manufacturing, when I think of supply chains, is kind of like a cornerstone of additive, but it might need a twist. Looking what has to happen to print and post-process a part, and I'm thinking of things like furnaces and CAT scans, X-ray machines, all the different pieces that have to come together to get something that flies. That's a lot of high-cost capital, and it's a pretty large footprint. It's not something that's going to be replicated in the supply chain for dozens of locations around the world. And it's not going to be concentrated all in one place and then distributed out either. I think both of those models are problematic from a supply chain. I think we need to think about maybe printing gardens and not print farms. Think about ecosystems that have worked for us, suppliers that are nearby. I think of where Ivan is at, right there in the center of the space industry, and with everybody near each other, things just tend to happen more smoothly. Models like that, is nothing really new. They've been around for a long time because they work. So I think that there's a little bit, at least from my point of view, less thought on something that's whiz-bang innovation and things that just are tried and true.
Ivan, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, obviously my perspective's unique from a supplier standpoint, but what I'm seeing is our customers are staying focused, staying the course is one thing, and looking for ways to collaborate a little bit differently. Whereas they had a plan to make historically internally with a smaller percentage to buy. I think that transition now is, how do I look at the supply chain differently and partner with them to accelerate the buy, where they don't have to make the capital investments, but really support someone that's a market leader to potentially scale their additive interest. So some of that has really taken place in the last 6 to 8 weeks. Had different discussions with some newer entities looking to engage in that facet. So that's encouraging as well.
Yeah, one of the other notable shifts that we saw recently as far as vertical integration supply chain strategies was evident with the news coming out of Toulouse, where Airbus canceled its plans to vertically integrate on the A320, Neo, and Nacelle and awarded the work to Collins Aerospace. I think it's interesting to see this. I kind of feel like we're at a stage where maybe what's in was out, what out is in. Ivan, can you comment on some examples that we've seen that are specific to additive manufacturing, where there might be significant supply chain strategy changes that are going to impact people?
I'm sorry, I missed part of, you faded out.
Can you comment on anywhere within additive manufacturing where you feel we might be seeing some notable shifts in supply chain strategies?
I would say, quite frankly, it's the consolidation of components. Again, that's the biggest portion of where I'm seeing some of the strategy, and hard to source components is really where the focus is at today. You know, it's kind of hard to discuss what some of the customers are doing, but for the most part, I think the consolidation of components is really come to the forefront, right? It's reducing the number of components you have to source, right? Instead of buying components, you're buying systems.
Understood. Simplification. All right, as we check in on our poll to the question, is your company rethinking their supply chain strategy due to the pandemic? We do have a 76% majority saying yes. So it sounds like across the audience, this seems to be impacting people and rethinking some of their strategies. Let's move to our next question, and I want to direct this one specifically to Philip with his global manufacturing view. What key strengths and weaknesses in the global manufacturing supply chain did the pandemic expose?
Yeah, so you know, in our industry, we rely a lot on low-cost country suppliers for a lot of our parts, but not exclusively, of course. And you know, I guess it goes also for all the heavy equipment manufacturers. But you know, we all have a story where we have, like, for example, a supplier which is not able to supply their pandemic supply what they need for us to assemble in our locomotives or our cars or subsystems. And you know, it's either because the supplier was shut down in their country, or their supply chain itself was not able to supply raw materials, or you know, whatever it is, or it actually went bankrupt. So you know, when you have 25,000 parts on a locomotive, you have a lot of exposed areas where you could be exposed. So the question basically comes down to, I come back to my plan A and plan B. What does your plan A and plan B look like, and are they too similar from each other? And do you have, for example, in both plans, suppliers from the same country, or are they getting their source of raw materials from the same location? Are you using the same carriers or same routes? I mean, how different or how diverse is your plan A versus your plan B? So I think this is, you know, a situation like this exposes those weaknesses that you have, or the strengths at the same time. So I think that's one thing. And you know, and if we bring this back to AM, and this is where additive can bring that diversity of to a plan B, and sometimes a plan B can become a plan A, but that's further down the road. But to me, this is where it's important to really assess how different and how diverse your plans, your supply chain plans are with respect to each other.
Thank you, Philip. Carlton or Ivan, do you have any perspective to add to that might be a little bit different or the same from an aerospace standpoint?
I'll make a comment, and John, I think you posted this on LinkedIn. Everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face, and that came from Mike Tyson. And having done contingency planning in my early career, you just can't plan for this, right? And it also exposed the fragility of the supply chain. Really, I would say, tier 2, tier 3 kind of partners, if you would, that you deal with, small businesses. And you know, it's disruptive for a large organization nonetheless, but for a small business that is deemed essential, you've got to pivot quite quickly. And you have exposure that you think you can contain internally, but you also have suppliers outside of your own walls that you have to contend with, and really take a level of sensitivity to a heightened level, right? You can't push for lead times. You can't push for things to be delivered on time, because that really goes out the window in some regard. You've got to take a human aspect to this thing, and lead with your heart, right? Not with your head. But nonetheless, it's still a business, right? So, but it did expose quite a bit from my view.
Thank you, Ivan. Carlton, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I might take the answer a little bit of a different direction. I listening to some of the answers here, and what Philip's talking about, plan A, plan B, and what Ivan says, that you can't plan for every contingency. I think they're right. I think back to about a decade ago when Fukushima happened, I was working in the semiconductor industry, and that just, you can't plan for something like that. Our entire supply chain was suddenly disrupted, and our customers faced tremendous challenges. And there was a lot of discussion after that, well, what do we do for the next time that something happens? And what happened actually was kind of interesting is that a lot of companies that we worked with stayed with the sole sourcing kind of model, if that's what they had to begin with, because of the economies that had built into their business models. But what they'd started to build was consignment stock models, deeper insights into their suppliers' inventory and other things. So they balanced that risk in a very different way. And it to me, it kind of simulates or is similar to some of the Industry 4.0 discussions of the more of a connected supply chain and deeper insights, so that we can manage the risk more proactively than reactively if something like that happens. But we'll see.
Thank you, Carlton. Interesting perspective. I want to go a little bit deeper on distributed manufacturing. One of our hypotheses as we started talking to people was that regional manufacturing or distributed manufacturing would increase in importance due to the global pandemic. And for context in this question, Neighborhood 91 is an additive manufacturing production campus that is being built at Pittsburgh International Airport. So the question that we asked was, would a regional cluster or supply chain ecosystem like Neighborhood 91 help mitigate supply chain disruptions and optimize the cost of AM? So within this, we saw yes and maybe, if you will, and very few no's. And so I'd like to launch into the next question, which is just the same. Would a regional cluster or supply chain ecosystem like Neighborhood 91 solve some of these supply chain problems that we're seeing right now, and how? And let's please start with Philip.
Yeah, so, in the additive space, I mean, talking for us here, we don't have dozens and dozens of machines, right? And when you look at the whole field of additive, I mean, we know there are tons of modalities and materials and post-processing solutions, finishing solutions, and things like that. So for us, I think it's one very interesting solution for solving that need for having various types of approaches to solving problems. There's not one, and we know not one modality for all problems, right? So a cluster like Neighborhood 91 for us is very interesting because of the fact that our product is very varied, requires all kinds of modalities. And so, yes, for us, in our case, where we are not, we've got dozens and dozens of machines available, this does help our supply chain problem.
I think this fits into, Carlton, your categorization of gardens. Do you have any more comments on that?
I like the model. I think for aerospace specifically, you'd have to go through all the qualification, all the testing and everything to make sure that the machines, the processes and everything align with the quality needs. And that's a big challenge. That takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort up front. So assuming that could happen, then a model like that, I think, could actually work.
Well, I think we have something similar, with Morph 3D being dead center to the aerospace defense market. We share the fence with Boeing. We're 5 minutes away from Raytheon, Northrop, SpaceX, right? All the players are in a real geo cluster, if you would. And that accelerates the communication, the collaboration, and the certification process, right? So I think being located with your customer that has an interest in AM. As Philip said, having a mixed modality also helps, right, to accelerate and have shared learnings across the industry, or at least a customer base that's interested in AM.
Yeah, I think throughout all of us, it's never just about the equipment or the hardware or the software. It's also about the people and the skills and having those right ones and having them at the level that you need to be doing the work that they need to be doing. Thank you for that. We're going to move into our final theme, which is getting more specific about the additive manufacturing supply chain. We're going to launch our third live attendee poll. And the question is, have you seen a change in your company's AM budget due to the pandemic? I want to once again reassure you that this is anonymous. We don't know who the responses are coming from. So please open those up, just in case there is sensitivity there. So as we see those results coming in, we'll go into our next theme. So one of the questions we asked was the same one. Have you seen a change in your company's AM budget, and was that a short or long-term change? For almost 50% of the respondents, we saw no change. And then we saw, several distributions and decrease in a short term, 6 months or less, and a decrease that was long-term. And then we did see that one little blip increase, which I suspect corresponds with the one blip of increase that we saw on the revenue chart. Also note that when we looked at the demographics of the companies, we saw that companies that have the majority of their revenue in AM were being hit harder or more negatively impacted on their AM budget than those that had only a portion of their revenue from AM. So I thought that was interesting as far as the different supply chain players and how they might be getting hit. We go into our next question. What are the biggest risks for the additive manufacturing supply chain due to the pandemic? Let's start with Ivan this time, please.
Yeah, this one's interesting. I think we touched on it yesterday. And look, I think we had a good run. We've been steadily increasing the exposure to AM in the application space and acceptance of AM. But that requires a significant amount of capital. And one of the conversations or points that we had yesterday was really a potential slowdown in the investment side, right? Clearly, the investments that we make on the AM side are for the long term. This isn't a short-term gain. This is more about long-term investments to fuel this industry that's still very nascent. So one of the biggest risks right now is, I would say, an ability. I don't call it a failure to launch, but that would be a way I would describe it. This could be a setback, but it's also an opportunity to rethink, reshape what is important and how we leverage AM for future applications. So in the short term, I think people are a little jittery from an investment standpoint, as typical. I think in the long term, the companies that really stay focused on what AM really can do for the supply chain are going to be the winners, right? That's really the way I look at things. So making an investment now isn't for a 2-3 year return. It's literally a lot further out than that.
Yeah, it kind of speaks to some of the smaller players and whether they can, survive such a downturn and get the investment that they need, which I think parlays well into Carlton's perspective.
Yeah, I've worked, even though I work for Boeing, it's a large multinational company. Most of my work actually was emerging technologies and a lot of time with startups. And I've been thinking about the startup ecosystem a lot lately. Many of those companies in the additive world were established just a few years ago, and they're now looking for their Series B and their Series C funding. As Ivan just said, money's kind of a little bit hard to come by. I've talked to some VCs in the past few weeks there. It's a little bit harder for them to raise their next funds than it was a few years ago. Money's in short supply, and that's a concern. I kind of worry a little bit that all the technology that we are expecting to come to market here in the next few years, some of that may not make it. We're going to have fewer choices. I'm kind of concerned what happens with the IP and the knowledge and these great teams that were built. What happens to all that innovation and where that goes. there's been a lot of activity in the last few years in the startup ecosystem around additive. Exciting work. And I'm not really sure what the future looks like.
Thank you. How about from your perspective, Philip?
I mean, look, the additive clearly has, I mean, whatever your risk, by the way, there's an opportunity. So clear, in this case, additive has a great opportunity to prove, at least in the heavy equipment manufacturing space, that it is a viable solution. I mean, it's, you know, we're of course way behind the aerospace world in this space. But at the same time, the risk is that, you know, we do know speed is a great factor you know, in providing solutions. But I mean, at the same time, the risk is not to live up with to the expectations that that we bring. So, you know, and that's why we need to continue driving cost, getting more materials available, making sure our qualification processes are streamlined, and also the approvals. In our industry, a lot of approvals that need to be obtained for getting our parts on assets. So basically, there's you know, like I say, a huge opportunity in our industry, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we live up to those expectations and explain, you know, the limits of additive very clearly, and not just say it's the holy grail to everything. So education is very important, but also at the same time, we all know that, you know, driving costs and is very important for us in our industry.
You had mentioned previously that it really helped you refine your priorities. So it didn't necessarily mean you were going to spend less, but it made you focus to make sure you were spending on the right things.
It's more about reallocating where the need is now. I mean, we have not, for us, it's really reshifting where it's required. And like I say, you know, as we kept on operating, we just need to readjust in that space.
Thank you. So we had another survey question that was around long-term business models. The pandemic highlighted some unique capabilities of AM for solving short-term supply issues. And we asked, do you see long-term sustainable business models being created using AM as a result of the pandemic? So the majority of respondents in the survey were at yes or maybe, with just a few no's. And so let's launch into our next questions. That is still in the theme of business models. Do you believe, from your perspective, that AM providers should change or adapt their business models due to the pandemic? Ivan, let's start with you, please.
Personally, staying the course. Aerospace defense was a long game to begin with. So it doesn't change much on our end. I think just staying the course, staying focused, continuing to serve our customers' needs our partner. So I'm staying the course.
Thank you. How about Carlton, from your perspective?
I think when I think about changing business models, I don't think companies really talk about their real problems openly. I spend a little bit of time in the business development world, and it takes a lot of work to really understand the nature of your customer's problem. That's the nature of corporate business. I think additive manufacturing specifically, the supply chain, the providers really need to ask what problems they need to solve and avoid pitching ideas at random. I think it takes the conversation to a more productive place. I think listening is really important. I know that for Boeing, we're taking a lot of extra effort to really listen to our customers, really trying to demonstrate empathy to what they're experiencing, trying to figure out what we need to do to respond to that, and then that'll eventually flow down to our supply chain. But to me, it's when I think about business models, honestly, it's a lot about listening.
Excellent advice. Philip, from your perspective?
Yeah, for us, I mean, we're not changing our business model or even our strategy. I think what this provided is reinforced the strategy that we had was the right one. You know, we're developing aluminum applications now for lowering the costs and lightweighting solutions for the passenger rail business, which is very similar to the aerospace world. But But for us, it's about, our strategy has been cost. And I mentioned it earlier, it's all about cost, because in the heavy equipment manufacturing world, it's, cost is a very important factor. So one of our strategies has been to, we're running now the GH2 binder jet machine, and that allows us to reduce the cost of parts, 2 to 10x from what we're able to do with powder bed fusion. So, like I say, to us, cost was one of our strategies, and basically just, as the pandemic has highlighted that we need to really make sure our cost points are adequate, we just got reinforced more into this strategy. So, it confirmed our bet in that space.
Thank you, appreciate that. I did want to just check in on our poll that we launched previously and not leave it behind. So for the answers to have you seen a change in your company's AM budget due to the pandemic, this one was a little bit more close. Yes, 60%, and no was 40%. So now we're going to launch into our open Q&A. So please feel free to submit questions via chat. We have received several, and so we will go ahead and launch into those. The first question is, can anyone speak to a unification of OEMs or software open manufacturing, and how the Internet of Things can be used to monitor, control, and additive manufacturing chains, or will it remain siloed? Carlton, do you have an opinion, or Philip?
So yeah, that's something where, coming back to the notion of Neighborhood 91, I think having a unification of OEMs which have the same objective in mind, of course non-competing OEMs, but to have that same objective in mind, the same type of space, I think it could be beneficial, because again, we can't buy everything out there in the market. We just need solutions, and but at the same time, we also know that come back to harping on the cost. What in our industry, what can kill the drive towards AM is having costs which are just not sustainable. So unification of OEMs in that space is could be one of those potential solutions.
Yeah, I think that
We have
if there is some sort of unification with OEMs, I agree with Philip, and that could be very, very helpful. I also think that it might happen down the road though too, because their business models were built on a lot of them on a very vertically integrated type of model, and that's hard to shift from. But at least if there's some bridging between them, I think that makes things a lot smoother and makes things a lot easier, especially for somebody that's trying to implement additive.
Thank you. We have another question that I think would be appropriate for Carlton based on his background. With the equities drying up temporarily, impacting the overall speed of innovation in AM, doesn't it put more emphasis on solving cost problems with the supply chain?
That is a really good question. I think that really one of the important words that I heard there was speed. And that may be what I frame my answer around, is that when funding slows down, regardless of where it's coming from and what you're working on, a lot of times projects just don't evaporate. They tend to be put on hold and things slow down, and then they tend to pop out later on, sometimes in a different shape or a different form. I'm not sure if we're going to emphasize cost problems with the supply chain necessarily, because additive just isn't a cost solution. If it was, if additive was easy and it was all about cost, then I don't think we'd be having these discussions, honestly. There's a lot more to additive. Ivan stated it really well earlier when he talked about part consolidations. We talk about increased reliability of parts and how they can enable you to do things in ways that you can't. And that enabling can bring tremendous value. So I try to stay away from just the focus on cost and look at what the technology brings more holistically.
Philip or Ivan, do you have comments on that one? All right, one of the other questions we have is, have there been any government-funded incentives for industry to further pursue local supply chains for AM? If yes or no, do you think this might change? Do any of you guys have knowledge in this area?
Yeah, we have not seen that. I mean, Neighborhood 91 is one of those solutions, if you will. But in terms of to pursue local supply chains. We have not seen that necessarily. I think it's been more about making sure we can respond or developing technologies to help responding to the pandemic. That's where we've seen government funding appear.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Yeah, and I'll kind of say from our perspective, there are some active programs around building up the additive manufacturing supply chain, particularly from the DoD. But I do see that we're seeing funding from players like NIST and other ones that are pretty, I would say, broad with respect to what they might be kind of accepting as good projects. So I would say to answer this one from our perspective, I think it's a possibility that that'll continue to be something that there would be at least alignment between funding and projects and concepts on.
Well, they're core strategies for national defense too. So, I mean, I think been mandated and it's pretty well recognized. So investments, I mean, there's, I guess, ways to see that, right? The government is funding the larger primes, the defense primes, and clearly some of that money is trickling down to supply chain. But as far as, local supply chains and things of that nature, that's not, I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Let's switch topics to people and skills. AM has always had a fair amount of hype associated with it, but for the supply chains to swing back, there will have to be people with skills. If the hype is successful in companies to shift their supply chains, are we ready? Is there a skill shortage with AM, i.e. if the work does want to come back, are we prepared to take advantage of the scenario?
I take that one. I mean, I think there has been a tremendous skill shortage in AM for a long time. And what I mean by that is that, you have specific skills for operating machines, for designing and things like that. But to me, if we want AM to be adopted at scale, it has to be, inherent. It has to be, of course, part of the curriculums of students coming out of school and getting onto the job market, and it is becoming more and more. But it has to be as embedded as traditional manufacturing is. So to me, skills is, yes, there's specific skills or very pointed skills in AM, but the general understanding of AM is, to me, a huge shortage, and addressing that, I think, will go a long way.
I'll add to that. I think from a training and development standpoint, it's one thing to have a skill in additive. The other is how do you purchase additive components? I think it's is a big challenge. For example, if you're buying a system that has integrated components of a structure, heat exchanger that's multifunctional, that's not how you traditionally buy these components. So what's the value of that component in the AM sense versus a series of machine parts or forgings or castings, if you would, that are then assembled. So you have to transform the way you're thinking first, right? To really be educated, to understand how you can apply additive. The rest, from an engineering capability and technical standpoint, difficult, but can be trained, but definitely a shortage, nonetheless.
The really important portion of that, Ivan, is the people kind of tend to focus on skills being the technical. They think of DFAM and high level things like that, where just as important within the organization is the business side and understanding the value proposition and pricing models for AM. We see a lot of confusion for people assessing that with just not understanding the technology enough to really assess it appropriately.
And the parts aren't priced the same. They're different because they are more integrated, and you do collapse supply chains downstream and different processes downstream. So you really have to have a conversation around the end product itself and how it impacts the assembly line, for example, or the inspection or integration into its final kind of assembly. There's a lot involved.
So Carlton mentioned that industry, quote, does not really share what their actual problems are. Do you think that industry cross-collaborative R&D has become even more conservative in the past few months and perhaps in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I think that's possible. It's hard to do cross-industry collaboration when it's hard to meet and have that, build those relationships and have those conversations. I think when companies are trying to be more conservative, at the same time, though, if it's done correctly, partnerships and collaborations can actually be a win-win scenario where it saves you time and money and other people's time and money too. So they can actually be a solution to a very conservative environment. I've done a lot of partnerships over the years, and what I've learned is that both people have to walk away with something that's very valuable, otherwise they just collapse. And that's often usually what happens, is that value proposition in the partnership doesn't align with one of the members, and so the partnership tends to dissolve. And so that's, I think, more than maybe becoming disappearing or something like this, the partnerships that are being built and the ones that'll happen in the foreseeable future are really going to have to focus on each of the parties and what they're going to bring to the table and what they're going to get out of it, and then they'll work.
Appreciate that.
I mean, from my side, I would say it's always of mutual benefit, meaning we give and they benefit. No, but the collaborations, as I stated earlier, we're seeing that more, again, from newer interested parties to accelerate, material characterization, tons of data. They want access to it so that they can accelerate. So on the R&D side, I think they're being a little bit more open to sharing data, paying for data, and co-ownership of data, which really, I can't say the name of one particular customer, but I think we've done 3 material characterizations with them, and there's been a healthy exchange of data where they pay for testing, we provide some machine time, and we both get data, but it really has accelerated their adoption and use of about 3 materials so far in less than 10 months. Which is unprecedented. It would be 1 material in 10 to 12 months, right? So that's helping them accelerate not only their adoption, but use of AM and insertion.
All right, I think we'll do the final question before we do our panel closeout question. Are there any suggestions on how best to engage OEMs at the correct level to discuss manufacturing solutions using AM? Many of our legacy OEM contacts either do not have responsibility to source AM or are not necessarily knowledgeable of the benefits of AM.
I can start on that one. So, I mean, look, for those of us who are in this space for a while, we know that, taking a part which is designed for traditional manufacturing and say we're just going to print it, never or rarely, 1%, 2% of the time, it doesn't work. Okay, so basically, it's not about sourcing an AM part. Okay, so and then we don't. The way we look at it is, you're not taking a machine part and say I'm going to print it. I'm going to have better opportunities. You have to design. At least in our space, you have to design for additive, or else it just doesn't work. So basically, by that being said, is that the approach for me, if the idea is to go and see sourcing and say, hey, I can get you the parts, and that's sometimes we get this feedback from sourcing, say, hey, we can print the parts, but once you start looking at all the costs, it doesn't work. So you really have to come back to the source. And AM to me is an engineered product. And when I say engineered, so it's not just for engineering, it's manufacturing. But basically, go back to the source and design for additive. So to me, how do we best engage with the OEMs? It's really going to the source, and not about saying, hey, I can give you that, I can provide you an additive part. It's more about the solution. People are not looking for printed parts; they're looking for solutions. And if it happens to be a printed part, fantastic. And how can we leverage the advantages of additive is really the question in finding the solutions to problems.
Thank you, Philip. I think we will launch into our final question. Anyone that knows me knows that I at least like to err towards the side of optimism when possible. So we've had some pretty heavy topics. So I want to ask our panelists, what is one coronavirus silver lining? And let's start with Philip.
Okay. Yeah. So for us, again, I'm coming from the heavy equipment industry. additive is still, at its beginnings, and explaining additive is a continuous task for us. So, we're 27,000 employees in 50 countries, as I mentioned earlier. And what this actually helped us to do is put a focus on additive and actually explain it better to the businesses, and what it does, and especially what it can't do. How does it work, and when not to use it, and when to use it. So that's one of them. And secondly, it helped us focus. So I'll take a phrase from the former GE CEO, John Flannery, who said, focus is focus, and use that in the context of how to select a division to be divested. So for us, we use it all the time. So focus is focus. It helped us to focus where we should be putting our energies. Which projects and which solutions have the biggest impact? Has the impact that we thought was there pre-COVID still there, and is there a new biggest impact solution out there? So focusing, it really was one of those elements that it helped us to say, okay, let's reevaluate our portfolio. What are we doing? And so yeah, just make sure we've got the most impactful projects out there.
Carlton, what's your silver lining?
I was privileged through the pandemic to lead Boeing's additive manufacturing proposal effort to develop and manufacturing face shields. It was a response to the PPE shortages. And Boeing donated them to FEMA, and they got them to health workers. And I think part of the silver lining in all of that was that I really got to see firsthand barriers break down and amazing behaviors demonstrated both inside of Boeing and outside through our supply chain and all the partners that helped us. Too many to mention, but a lot of them. I think that it really, for the first time in a long time, brought an example of additive forward that everybody could connect and relate to. It made our discussions internally run a lot smoother because people had firsthand of experience when we said we could solve problems with additive and what that really meant, both the benefits and some of the limitations. And in the result, it bought enough time for standard supply chains to stand back up and show that we could deliver value. So to me, that was a real silver lining.
Last but not least, Ivan, come on, optimism.
You guys are gonna laugh. Homeschooling, that's the silver. No, quite frankly, I think the conversation has resurfaced in the executive room, and the folks that we've been working with that had an idea or an opportunity for a business case for AM are being heard now. So that those conversations are active, and I think it's important that listening at least and exploring where AM's going to head and develop into the future is really something that should be embraced. So I think the conversation at the boardroom level or executive strategy level is certainly something that we're starting to see a little bit more of.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you all bringing a little optimism, a little smiles to the end of our panel here. Some of the words that I wrote down as we were going through was intelligent sourcing, speed and cost, right showing, gardens, collaboration, punch in the face, delays in innovation, education. But three that I really circled in particular, all of you commented at some point about heart and kindness and empathy. And this goes not only to individuals, but from a business. We are all in this together, and we're all a part of a vital supply chain. So finding a way to make sure we don't erode trust and maintain that kindness and empathy. I really appreciate you guys highlighting that. So thank you so much for joining the panel. I do want to highlight, please save the date for July 30th. Our fearless leader, John, is going to lead us in our second dialogue, Qualified for Production. And we also have, for those that are interested, please consider sticking around for another 5 minutes to learn about Neighborhood 91, the world's first AM production campus presented by John. But I just want to say a huge thank you to Philip, Carlton, and Ivan for your insights and your valuable time, and to all of our audience for joining in. I really do wish I could see everyone's faces. And at this point, you're now welcome to either bid us farewell or to stay on as we transition to the Neighborhood 91 topic. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Okay, we're now going to transition to John and Neighborhood 91.
Great. Thank you for that. And we need to pull up the file. So really quickly, what I would say is that Neighborhood 91 has progressed very, very quickly. We have made a lot of progress in the 18 months that we've been going. And you may ask yourself, well, what is Neighborhood? Neighborhood 91 was a project that was put forth by the Pittsburgh International Airport. It has partners with the University of Pittsburgh and Aaron Sebia, as well as the Barnes Group Advisors. So when we look at what problem are we with, we've been able to make investments in infrastructure. And that infrastructure is in the form of recaptured argon in microgrid for consistent power supply and good quality electricity, as well as a central powder storage facility. So these are things that are fundamentally affecting the economics of additive manufacturing. So if you take the 2-hour radius around Pittsburgh, the entire metal additive manufacturing supply chain exists. It's really just not connected. And that's our primary goal, is to show how we can shrink that ecosystem down to a 200-acre garden, to use Carlton's borrowed term. Our success factors, we believe, are the argon gas recycling, which is a huge component of powder manufacture, metal powder manufacture. It's also used in printing. It's also used in heat treatment. So that ability to recapture and recycle argon, which will then drastically reduce the cost of argon, is really going to be a big deal. The powder storage facility is there as a convenience for the tenants of Neighborhood 91. It's also now acting as a distribution facility for companies that don't have a North American presence. So the powder storage facility is a facility designed to store powder. It's as simple as it sounds. And we are working with Homeland Security and the townships and the fire marshal to ensure that all of that is met, so that all the individual companies don't have to worry about it. We're taking care of that situation for them, and it should just make the whole thing leaner. And kind of picking up on what Carlton said earlier, this type of campus will also reduce the end customer's expenses too. So when you think about even from a field service engineer from one of the printer manufacturers, going to a single campus and servicing many printers is a much more efficient approach than trying to cover the entire region or continent. Similarly, if you're a parts inspector for an aircraft manufacturer, you can come to Neighborhood 91 and you can hit the entire supply chain by walking. So we think that it's going to really shift the needle on costs and time to produce, which is effectively, once again, cost. So just as a quick update for you, so building 1 is now full. So if we can maybe move to the map, or maybe I can do that. Yeah. So it's a 200-acre campus. We're currently developing the first 13 acres. What is shown here is cluster A. The airport is over here to the right, and you can see one runway there at the top. So cluster A is being developed currently. Building A1 is full. Building A2 is somewhere between 25 and 50% full, and the powder storage facility is 50 to 60% full. So we've had a great deal of progress in the first 18 months. So really, since we've seen the pandemic, and there's a lot of discussion about that, it has reinforced the focus that this is a solution. So that's very positive. Fundamentally, if we talk to our friends at University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, et cetera, we find that cluster or agglomerated economies really work for additive manufacturing. So we're solving a fundamental economic problem with this campus. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. You can always go to neighborhood91.com for our white paper on the benefits of the campus. And if you need more information, simply just send us an email to either info@neighborhood91.com or john@thebarnes.group, and we will get in touch with you.
All right. Are there any, let's see, looking at the questions that are coming in now. The one question is, are you able to share who any of the existing tenants are? And are they more service or OEM related?
No and yes. I will tell you that we have two companies that are going to produce printed parts. One is an OEM that they'll be mostly producing for their own consumption, and the other is more of a contract manufacturer that produces parts for others. We have a test lab, we have a heat treater, and seems like I'm leaving somebody out. And we're on the hunt for specifically powder production right now. That's one area that we're specifically targeting. Hopefully that answers part of your question. Melanie, we'd naturally love to see a lot of Formalloy printers running at Neighborhood 91.
All right. Any other questions? Thank you, Melanie. Any other comments or questions on Neighborhood 91?
And I might just say, you know, for people that aren't associated with parts productions but are still part of the supply chain for additive, you know, we're open to kind of creative solutions. This is a bit of an experiment. It hasn't existed before. So how we link and tie together and collaborate is kind of a whiteboard that we can work on.
All right. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. Obviously, if you are interested in learning more, just reach out. John always responds promptly to emails. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're now going to close our panel. Have a great day.